Welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 25 of ASP.NET GridView tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about inserting, updating, and deleting data from GridView without using data source controls. Now in part 23 of the ASP.NET GridView tutorial, we discussed about inserting, updating, and deleting data from GridView using sqldatasource control. And in part 24, we discussed about doing exactly the same thing using ObjectDataSource control. After watching these two videos, a lot of my YouTube subscribers has actually asked me whether if it is possible to perform insert, update, and delete on GridView without using data source controls at all. Absolutely, it's definitely possible, and that's what we will be discussing in this video. We will be modifying the example that we used in part 24, so I strongly recommend to watch parts 23 and 24 of ASP.NET GridView tutorial before proceeding with this video. Without further ado, let's flip to Visual Studio. Now, if you remember, in part 24, we were using this object data source control to retrieve and display the data within the GridView control. So we don't want to be using these data source controls. So let me get rid of that object data source control. And since this grid view is associated to that object data source control using data source ID property of the grid view control, let's go ahead and get rid of that data source ID property. Look at that, data source ID is equal to object data source 1. We have just deleted that object data source control, so let's get rid of this data source ID property. And look at this, after I have deleted that, and when I try to save it, I get a warning message. Now that's because the object data source control that's associated with this grid view control is removed. So it's asking me, whether if I want to refresh fields and keys for grid view 1, and I'm going to select no here because I want to retain all the template fields and validation controls that we have on this grid view control. Okay, so that's why I said no. Alright, so that's our first step. Get rid of the object data source control and then remove the association between the grid view control and object data source control by deleting that data source ID property. And the next step, since we have already deleted that object data source control, if you remember in the code behind file, we were actually using that object data source control. So I don't want this method anymore. Okay, now when is this method called? This method is actually called when we click this insert button within the footer of the grid view control. Okay, but then we are doing that using object data source control, and we don't have that object data source control anymore, and I will not be using this method going forward. So I'm going to completely get rid of this method, lb insert underscore click. Okay, so let's delete that. And since we don't have this event handler method anymore, but that's being actually referred by the link button that we have within the footer control. Look at that, within the footer of employee ID column. So let's go into the grid view control, into the footer of employee ID template field. So this is the template field where we have employee ID, and within the footer template we have this link button, and then there is this onclick attribute of the link button, which is actually referring to that method which we have just deleted. So let me get rid of this onclick attribute. Okay, alright. So what's the next step? So we have done these 4 steps until now. Okay, the next step is basically, if I flip this web form to the design mode, look at this. This edit and delete buttons are displayed within the grid view control using using a column type called command field. So the edit and cancel buttons are actually displayed using a command field. Okay, now I don't want this command field. Instead of that command field, I'm going to use a template field, so I'll have better control when I use a template field. So basically, I'm going to get rid of this command field, and then I'm going to use a template field there. And obviously when we use a template field, we are going to have edit item templates, etc. Okay, so let's go ahead, copy and paste a template field there, and I have typed this HTML just to save some time. So let me copy it, paste there, let's format it by pressing Ctrl K and D, and then we'll go over the HTML. So it's actually pretty simple. I have a template field here, and then if you look at that template field, actually, yeah, so if we look at that template field that we have just copied and pasted, we have an item template and an edit item template. Okay, so obviously item template is used when the row is rendered normally, and when I put the row in edit mode, that's when edit item template is used. Now look at this, when the row is rendered normally, we want the edit button and delete link buttons. Okay, and that's what I have in item template. So if you look at the item template of the template field I just copied and pasted, I have two link buttons. Okay, one is for edit, so that displays edit text, and the other displays delete text, as you can see here. Okay, and the other important properties that you need to pay attention to here is obviously ID. That's every control needs to have an ID, and command argument. Look at that. What are we, we are setting this command argument property to employee ID. So whatever this eval method is returning back, it's actually returning back employee ID. Okay, so we are using that employee ID as a value for this command argument. Later we'll actually see how we are going to use that command argument property of this link button. And then obviously I have this command name here. So if you look at the command name, I have set it to a hard-coded string edit row. Okay, those are the two important properties that we need to set on this link button, because later when we edit a row we'll be using those properties. Okay, and then for color run at is equal to server, and that's the text. Similarly for delete button, command argument, again it's going to contain the employee ID. Command name is going to contain this delete row. Okay, and the rest of the properties are similar. So that's item template. But then when I put the row in edit mode, look at that, delete button should not be visible, and then I should get update and cancel buttons, and that's what I have in edit item template, another two link buttons. And look at the text that I have, update and cancel, because when we put the row in edit mode, I don't want delete link button, I want update and cancel link buttons, and that's what I have here. Okay, again if you look at the command argument, it's going to take employee ID. Command name is, look at that, that's a little different. When I click this update, what do we want to do? We want to update that row, and that's what I have set it to, update row. In a bit you'll understand how we will be using this command name property and command argument properties. And obviously when we click the cancel link button, we want to cancel update, so that's what I have set command name to. You can give it any meaningful name. I've just happened to choose update row and cancel update. Okay, and yeah, that's the edit template field, which is going to display the link buttons for editing and deleting. Another small modification that I want to do, look at the link buttons here, they have a different color, but this link button within the footer template has a blue color. I want even that insert button to have the same color as edit and delete buttons, and obviously to do that all you need to do is this link button has got a 4-color property. So let's set the 4-color property on the insert link button as well. Where is that insert button present? It's present in the footer template of employee ID template field. So let's go to employee ID template field, which is this one, and within the footer template I have this link button. All I'm going to do is set 4-color, and now if we flip this to design mode, as you can see, look at the color is the same as that. Okay, alright, so that's our 6th step, to include template field. And then we are done actually with designing the web form. Now it's code. Obviously we don't want to use any data source controls, so I don't have data source controls at all. But remember, we have this employee data access layer which has got these methods, get all employees to retrieve employees from our TBL employees table. And then similarly we have delete employee method, update employee method, insert employee method. Now if you need explanation about these methods, we discussed about them in part 24, so I strongly recommend to watch part 24. So we have this employee data access layer with these methods. So what I'm going to do now, in our web form, I'm going to write a simple private method. Okay, so private void, and let's actually copy and paste that just to save some time. So if you look at the private method that I have here, all it's doing is, look at the name, bind GridView data. So what are we doing? We are calling get employees method that's present in employee data access layer. And if you look at what this method is returning, it's returning list of employees. So we are setting that list of employees as the data source for the GridView control and invoking data bind. So obviously when the page loads, when the web form first loads up, what I want to retrieve basically I want to call this method bind GridView data. Okay, basically, this method is going to call employee data access layer, get employees. It's going to retrieve the employees, set that as data source, and invoke data bind. So obviously now when we run this web form, as you might expect, we should be able to display that data within the GridView control. Okay, so we have that, and look at this. When I click insert, I get validations and all because we already have that HTML in place. Okay, but obviously now when I click edit or delete, nothing is going to happen because we haven't implemented what the click of those buttons should be doing. Okay, so now the next step is to basically, we have done this as well. We have called the in the page load, when the first time when the web form loads up, if it's not a post back, if it's the initial get request, call this bind GridView data method, which is going to load that data within the GridView control. Okay, the next step basically is to generate an event handler for this GridView control. Now look at this. Within this GridView control, I have several buttons. Within every data row, we have edit, delete buttons. We have, once I click edit, we are going to show update and cancel buttons. And then within the footer template, I have insert button. Okay, now whenever I click these buttons within these rows of this GridView control, an event is raised, and that event is called as row command event. So anytime you click a button within the GridView control, it's going to raise an event called a row command. So let's go ahead and generate that row command event by going into the properties of the GridView control. So row command event, let's double click here to generate the event handler, and within this row command event handler, I'm going to paste in some code, and we'll go over that in just a bit. Again, this is very simple to understand. It's just that we have several if-else blocks. Okay, so if you remember when we were designing our GridView control, okay, especially when we have included those template fields, template field which is displaying this edit, delete, update, and cancel buttons, we have set a very important property of those link buttons here. Look at this. Within the first template field, I have 4 link buttons. Okay, and each link button has got a command name: edit row, delete row, update row, cancel update. These command name properties are what determines which button the end user has clicked. So within our code behind file, look at this. When is this event raised? Anytime the user clicks a button within the GridView control. Okay, now which button the user has clicked, how do we determine that? Using the command name property of this GridView command event arguments object that's coming in. So e.command name, if that is equal to edit row, that means we know for sure the user has clicked this edit button, at which point we want to put that row in edit mode. And to put a row of the GridView control into edit mode programmatically, we use a property of the GridView control called edit index. So if you look at edit index property, it requires an integer, the row index, which you want to put in edit mode. For example, if I click edit on the first row, the row index there is 0. So I need to retrieve the index row within the GridView control on which the the user has clicked edit. And to retrieve row index, it's a little tricky thing. Look at that. What we are doing here, basically, we are saying e.command source. Okay, this GridView command event arguments object. So how did we land into this event handler? Somebody has clicked some button on this GridView control. So which button the user has clicked, how do I know that? Using this GridView command object. So e.command source. Now that command source, we know for sure it's going to be a link button, either edit, delete, insert, etc. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're actually typecasting that to be of type link button. And we know that the link button is actually present. Where is this link button? Edit or delete or insert, where are these present? These are actually present within a GridView row. Okay, so the parent of these link buttons, the parent control of this edit and delete link buttons is nothing but a GridView row. Okay, so when I use this property, look at that, e.command source will give me the link button. I'm typecasting it to the link button. But if you look at command source, it's actually returning an object type. But we know we will get a link button back. Okay, so that's why I'm typecasting it to link button. and then that link button on that typecasted object, I'm using a property called naming container. Naming container is going to return the parent control within which that control is present. So here, for example, the edit link button is present within the grid view row. That's the parent control for edit link and delete link buttons. So naming container will give me the parent container, which is grid view row. And obviously this grid view row object has got row index property, which we are using here. So naming container will give us a grid view row, but then if I hover my mouse over naming container property, it's actually returning a control back. So we need to typecast it to be of type grid view row. Okay, so and grid view row object, after I typecast it has got a row index property, which is going to give me the row index, where the user has clicked the edit button. Okay, so it's the only a little tricky part, otherwise the rest of the code is pretty straightforward. Alright, so once we get the row index, we use that to determine which row to put into edit mode using the edit index property of GridView1 control. And then obviously after we put the row in edit mode, we need to call this method bind GridView data. If you remember what this method is doing, it's going to go back to that method get all employees, retrieve data, and then bind it to the GridView control. Okay, so that's when we click the edit link button. Okay, on the other hand, when I click delete link button, then what should happen? So if the command name is delete row, then what should we do? We should actually delete the employee. And to delete the employee within employee data access layer, I have got this delete employee method, and all you need to give it is employee ID. And if you remember, when we were including those link buttons, we have set a command argument to employee ID. So that's what we are retrieving here. So command argument property, that's going to return an object back, but we know it's going to be an integer. That's why we are converting to integer and passing it to delete employee method. And then after we delete that, we are again calling this bind GridView data. Okay, so that's the whole reason why we have these two lines of code in this method. Since we don't want to be repeating these two lines, we encapsulated them into this method, and then we call that method wherever required. Because every time you delete a row or put a row in edit mode, or you update a row, you have to retrieve the data and bind it back to the GridView control. Okay, and that's what this method is doing. So that's delete. And obviously cancel update. So when we are in edit mode, look at that, when we are in edit mode, and then when I click this cancel button, what should happen? We should remove the row from edit mode and then rebind the data to the GridView control. And how do I remove this row from edit mode? Set edit index of the GridView control to something negative. So here I am setting it to -1. Do I have a row within the GridView control with index -1? No. Index starts at 0, row index. We don't have a row with -1, so obviously no row will be put into edit mode. And then finally we are calling again bind GridView data. And the next one is the update row. So when we click on update, after we click edit, the row is in a update edit mode. And then when I click this update button, what should we do? We should retrieve name, gender, city, and employee ID and pass those values to update employee method. Okay, because update employee method expects all those 4 parameters. So we need to retrieve employee ID. So how do we retrieve employee ID? Again, if you remember, we can retrieve that using command argument property of that link button. Okay, and then obviously we need to retrieve the values that are present in these text box controls. Now obviously, how are we doing that? Look at that, gridview1 dot rows. So within the rows of which row, how do we know the row index? Again, we are retrieving the row index. That's the same logic. So within the GridView rows collection, go to that specific row, and then within that row find a control, for example to retrieve gender, find a control called drop down list 1. So when this row is in edit mode, remember we will use edit item template. So within webform1.aspx, when the row is in edit mode, we will use edit item template. For example, for gender, if you look at that, so here we have gender template field. When the row is in edit mode, we use edit item template, and look at the ID of the drop down list there, it's drop down list 1. Okay, so what are we doing within the code behind file? We're actually saying find that control with ID drop down list 1, retrieve the selected value out of the drop down list control, and then we are storing that in this variable, which is then being passed to this update employee method. And along the same lines we are retrieving name and city. Okay, this just simple to understand. All we are doing, GridView 1 in the rows collection, go to that specific row on which the user is going to click update, and then within that row find a control with that ID where we have name, and retrieve that using the text property. Okay, because find control always returns a control back. You need to typecast it to the type of object that you are expecting. In this case we are expecting a text box. For gender we are expecting a drop down list. Okay, pretty simple and straightforward. And after we update, so after we perform the update operation, we need to remove the row from edit mode. That's why we are setting it to -1 and calling bind GridView data. And finally we want to do the insert. So if the command name is insert, then what we need to do, we need to retrieve name, gender and city from the footer. So that's easy to do. GridView1.footerRow.find control. So within the footer control we have given IDs to those controls: txt city, ddl gender and txt name. So if you look at the webform's HTML, that's what you should notice. So for example, here footer template name is txt name, and similarly gender, you should see it as ddl insert gender. Okay, so it's actually ddl insert gender. We would have got an error if we would have run this code. So it's ddl insert gender. Let's copy that and paste it in find control method. And finally city text box is txt city. As you can see here, footer template text box txt city. Okay, so that's again straightforward. Retrieve those values and then pass them to this insert employee method, and then bind GridView data. Okay, so with these changes, let's go ahead and run this now. And at this point, as you might expect, edit, insert, update, delete, everything should work. So let's actually insert an employee test. Let's say male. Let's try to insert that. Look at that, city is required. I get that validation as required. Now let me say edit, and then let me try to blank something, and update, I get validation errors as expected. Okay, now let's change that to male and maybe test 5. Let's update that and see if it works as expected. So test 5 male Toronto. And similarly, let's say test 6, and let's say female, and let's say test. Let's insert that and see if it gets inserted. Okay, for some reason this is not working. Let's see why it's not working. The insert click, actually let's close this, let's rerun this right now. So test, male, and test. Let's look at that, the row is not being inserted. Let's see why is that. Because we know for sure, when we click any button, this row command event will be fired, and then we are saying do an insert when the command name is insert row. In our web form, let's see what we have as the command name for the insert link button in the footer control. Okay, probably we might have not set it at all. So let's check where is the insert button present. The insert button is present within the employee ID template field. So employee ID template field, we have the insert link button here, and if you look at this, we don't have command name property. Okay, so obviously when I click this button, the command name will be an empty string. There is no block which has an empty string as the command name, and that's why nothing happens. So basically we need to use this as the command name for the insert button. So let's specify that. So we actually need to specify that within the link button. So that's employee ID. Here is the link button. So let's set the command name is equal to insert. So that's very important. So now let's run this, and insert should work as expected. Okay, so let's say test 6 female test. Let's insert that. Look at that, it's working as expected. I put the row in edit mode, I click cancel. Look at that, everything works. Okay, actually there is a problem here. Now I put the row in edit mode, and then look at that, when I try to insert, obviously I get these validations because I don't have it here anything. Now let me get rid of that validate text there, and then let me try to cancel this. Look at that, I still get those validations when I empty this box out, and when I try to click cancel button, it's doing the validation. Similarly, when I try to delete this row, look at that, I still have those validations. Why is that? Because when I click these buttons, the web form is trying to post back, and if you remember, these validation controls, they don't have a validation group. So anytime you try to post a web form back, for validation controls that don't have validation group set, then they are going to be fired. And that's why we have those validation failures. But the point is, when we click cancel or delete buttons, we don't want those validations to be firing. So how do we prevent those validations from happening? All you need to do is, for those buttons, delete and cancel link buttons that you have, set causes validation property to false. So I have the link button here. I am going to set causes validation is equal to false for that, and do the same thing for cancel button as well. So that's the cancel button. I'm going to set causes validation false for that as well. Now let's run this, and when I click cancel or delete, there shouldn't be validation. So I put this row in edit mode, I knock them out, a property there, and then when I try to update, obviously validation should happen. But when I click cancel, or let's click delete here, when I click delete, this row should be deleted. Look at that, that row got deleted. Okay, and similarly when I try to update, let's put it in edit mode, let's try to update. Look at that, I get the validation, but when I click cancel, it will be removed from the edit mode without doing validation. So we use causes validation property for that. And another thing that I want to do is basically, this delete is dangerous operation. I want some client-side confirmation dialog box before the row can actually be deleted, because once a row is deleted, it cannot be undone. So I need a confirmation dialog box. Is it possible? Absolutely, and it's very easy to do. All you need to do is, if you look at the button here, this delete button that's present in a template field, and every button control, link button or a push button, these button controls have got a property called on client click. Okay, so this event, basically on client click, this event is raised on the client side, on the browser, even before the web form is posted back to the server. So to this event you can actually attach JavaScript code. So I'm going to use some a JavaScript function called confirm function. This confirm function will display a dialog box with OK and cancel button. Okay, so let me first use that confirmation function. So I'm going to call that, this is what is going to be the value. Let me paste that, and then I'll explain what it's doing. So we're using this confirm function. Let's run this and then see if we get what we expect. So when I click delete, look at that, it's asking me, are you sure you want to delete this row? When I click cancel, it won't get deleted, but when I click OK, that's when it will be deleted. And if you look at the code that we have, we're using JavaScript confirmation confirmation function, and if you look at this function, it's taking a parameter, are you sure you want to delete this row? So that's the message that's going to be displayed in that dialog box. And then this confirm function actually returns true or false depending on which button I have clicked. If I click OK, it's going to return true. If I click cancel, it's going to return false. When it returns true, I'm saying return the value of whatever this confirm function is going to return. If it returns true, then the web form will be posted back, and then whatever you have specified in that click event handler upon post back, that will be executed. But if it returns false, the web form will not be posted back. Okay, alright, look at this. When I click OK, it's going to be deleted. So we have seen how to perform insert, update, delete without using data source controls at all. Alright, on this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.